And welcome everyone. Is this on? Okay, great. That was a good start. Hello and welcome everyone, and thank you so much, Dan, and thank you to Ultimo Press, and congratulations on publishing Diana. As Dan said, tonight is a celebration, a launch of Diana's new novel that's just been released into the world, Seeing Other People. And you'll be delighted to discover its gripping, electric and unput-downable, with Diana's witty, cut-to-the-bone style. Seeing Other People is provocative, with a philosophical edge and a racy, page-turning style. Like Love and Virtue, it's an absolute cracker, to borrow Helen Garner's wonderful description. Diana's writing itself is a delight as she lifts up the surface of things with her sharp, precise prose. She also captures our city of Sydney in a rare lyrical way, so you breathe it in on every page. And they're just a few things that make her writing so addictive and lovable. Diana, a huge congratulations on this book. How does it feel to finally have it in bookshops?
Oh, thank you, and thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, it feels great. It's really exciting. You just sort of do all this work and then you reach a point where you can't control it anymore. Like, it's printed, so it is what it is. I hope you like it.
I thought we'd start with a bit of background about your first novel, Love and Virtue. Looking back, was the experience of publishing a book for the first time quite surreal, and was anything kind of a major surprise for someone who hadn't been in publishing before, in a sense?
Yeah, it was super surreal. I think that was probably compounded by the fact that it happened in lockdown. So it was sort of like this book existed in the world, but it was a world that was like separate to me through a screen, which kind of helped because it made it feel less like I sort of wasn't stressed about how people were responding to it because I was just still sitting in my bedroom. So I was like, oh, well, I won't know. I'll never have to interact with them. Yeah. But yeah, and in terms of surprises, I didn't have many expectations, and I was just so happy to be published at the first instance. So there wasn't much that was a surprise. But one thing that was really nice about it, which I hadn't anticipated, is and it sounds really corny, but there's just so much work that is done by people other than the author to get something like this onto the shelves. And I have just loved working with Ultimo Press, and I love every member of that team. And it's got my name on the front, but like it's such a team effort. And that was actually a really nice surprise, because I feel like it's actually easier to celebrate things that are done as a team almost, because it's like when it does well, the success is kind of compounded because we all share it. It's like not just about me.
And does it help when you go out to bookshops as well and you meet the booksellers personally?
I think it does help, because if you like eyeball them and you say, put my book on the shelf, then they have to do it. So yeah, I think it, I mean, that sounds a bit glib, but it's kind of not really an exaggeration. Like, I think that when you're a debut and they've never heard of you before, I think if you can go in and kind of talk to them about what it's about, then you're sort of front of mind. And so much gets published every month. So going out and talking to booksellers makes a big difference. And it's also nice to meet the people who sell books. And in Australia, we have quite a unique industry because it's not so dominated by Amazon or big online orders. So it's really nice to be on the ground in the local shops and seeing what a difference they make.
Because word of mouth was a big bit about it as well, wasn't it? Your book just took off, and everyone who read it would recommend it to other people, and the booksellers would recommend it, and of course the fabulous Ultimo Press would recommend it as well to everyone. But it really had that, it was just really catchy, wasn't it, in that sense?
Yeah, I know, it was good. Sometimes people will be like, oh, I lent it to several of my friends, and I'd be like, oh, yeah, they could buy it.
Yeah. So did you start writing Seeing Other People quite soon after, or did you have a break in between? How did that happen?
Yeah, I started it pretty soon after I sold Love and Virtue. My publisher, Robert, in the blue, he's matching the book, he gave me really good advice So when he bought Love and Virtue, he also bought a second book, and he said that I should start writing it straight away, because then it would mean that whatever the response was to Love and Virtue, it wouldn't really affect the drafting process for this one. And that's sort of what happened. So Love and Virtue came out this time last year, and I'd done a not very good draft of this at that point. So it wasn't publishable, but it was too late to go back. So however people reacted to Love and Virtue, it wouldn't affect the plot or any of those kind of big decisions.
What about the pressure you put on yourself? Was there any more of that the second time round?
People always ask me this. I think people want me to be like, it was agony. I was so, and it was definitely harder than writing Love and Virtue, but I don't think that was because of pressure I felt from an audience. I think it was a different thing, which is just when you write a first book, and in my case, I'd never really written anything before, so it was kind of like every idea I'd ever had and any interaction that I'd ever thought was mildly amusing or like anything I'd studied at uni all got put into that book. Right. And then you open a new Word document and you're like, well, that was all my ideas. And so so I think it was hard for that reason. It wasn't hard because I was like imagining an audience or imagining that they might be critical or anything.
So where did you start? Was there a catalyst for the idea for this one, or what was the place that you started at?
Yeah, so I started with, I'd noticed a trend, and I think it was probably a direct result of kind of the conversations around mental health that were happening in the first lockdown in 2020. And I just noticed that people my age were often encouraged to be our best selves and prioritise ourselves and set boundaries and put yourself first and all of those good things. But then it kind of made me think, well, what are the limits on that? And if you're always prioritising yourself and you're always trying to be the best, happiest, most fulfilled version of yourself, does it get to a point where you're actually just being selfish? And so that was, I knew I kind of wanted to explore that general idea, but I didn't really have a way to dramatise it. And then eventually I got to a kind of dramatic situation where basically in this book, one character's happiness and being her truest version of herself comes at the expense of the happiness of someone she really loves. And so she has to decide whether she wants to be a happy and fulfilled person or whether she wants to be her idea of a good person.
You were just talking about what was out there. Is there much more of your own life? I know that's another familiar question, but it is interesting, I think, to know. How do you filter your own experiences through your writing?
Yeah.
Is there much of you, I guess, in there?
Yeah, well, I think there is a lot of me in it, but perhaps not in the way that people would think. It's not as if there's any one character who's a stand-in for me, or as if there are particular events that have happened to me exactly how they happen in the book. But obviously, I don't think you can really write a novel without articulating your view of the world, because how I describe every place is how I personally perceive it, or even with characters who have life experiences that are different to mine, the way I kind of write about those experiences is I imagine how I would feel if I was in that position. So it kind of, I think that there's so much of me in both novels, but it's not really as kind of identifiable as a particular event or a particular person. It kind of just permeates throughout both books.
And the anecdotes sometimes you hear or bits and pieces like that?
You're a gossip, aren't you? Yeah, sometimes. Yeah, no, for sure, sometimes. Yeah. I think, a funny thing that's happened to me is that now sometimes I'll be in social settings, and because now my friends and people know I'm an author, and people will be like to me, oh, the craziest thing happened to me, you should put this in a book. So that's nice. But yeah, I guess.
And did you find the tone and the kind of the voice and the feel of the book quite easily with this second novel?
The tone was fine because I knew I wanted it to be, people might not think I achieved this aim, but I was trying to make it a bit comedic as well as exploring serious issues. So that was kind of consistent. But one thing I found very difficult was, so my first book was all written in the first person, and so it was just all the narrator talking, whereas this book is told from three different perspectives, and I found writing in the third person really hard. I don't know why. I just never tried to do it before, and I found it very difficult.
Yeah, it's funny because it really flows. In the beginning, it's almost like a tag team of different perspectives that you get, and it's so absorbing as a reader, I think, to have that, and it does. Like, you can't tell that it was hard to write.
Oh, thank you. Well, I could show you some spreadsheets of like who's talking when that would reveal that I struggled.
Now let's get into the book itself. Can you introduce the two sisters at the heart of the novel?
Yes, so the two sisters are called Eleanor and Charlie, and Eleanor is the older one, and she is more sensible and rational and takes it upon herself to be responsible, and she kind of takes everyone else's well-being into her own hands. And the younger one is called Charlie, and she's very beautiful, and she's an aspiring actress, and she's also very emotional, and people warm to her quite easily. And she's quirky.
And their physicality is very different as well, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I think that the older sister thinks it's more different than it is because she's just a bit like stockier and less beautiful. So I think she kind of blows out of proportion in her mind.
And this is not giving away too much of a spoiler at all, but because it happens right at the start, but can you tell us what that big event is that everything kind of folds out from? That happens to Eleanor in the start of the book.
Oh yeah, the book opens with Eleanor is broken up with by her boyfriend, and he sits her down and he says that he has hooked up with someone else, and then she kind of preemptively just says, okay, well, we have to break up. That's the only rational thing to do. And he tries to explain to her what happened, and she's like, no, I don't want to hear it. We're broken up. Bye. And
so that's Mark.
That's Mark who does that.
And he's a bit of a narcissist as well, isn't he?
Yeah. I don't know about Mark. He's I like hesitate to describe him because there's also a father in this book who's like not all there, so I don't want people to think that I hate men or something. There's some nice characters as well. There's nice male characters as well, but yeah, Mark is just I guess in modern parlance we'd call him, he's a bit of a soft boy. He is, I don't think he's conscious of it, but I think he like weaponizes his vulnerability to get girls to like him.
Nice character. But talking about the sisters again, could you give us a reading about them?
Yes.
Thank you.
So I'm going to read from the start of chapter 7, which is when the older sister Eleanor is going to a party that the younger sister, Charlie, is hosting at her share house. And it's not really Eleanor's scene. It's not a crowd she hangs out with very often. So, chapter 7. Arriving at Charlie's New Year's Eve party, Eleanor saw no one she recognised, but a type she was familiar with. They seemed to her one single person, bare skin and clothes cobbled together, usually arranged by colour. A purple tulle skirt underlining a bare, chiselled chest. Red flare jeans belted at the waist and a red bikini top. Black underwear, black tape on the nipples, like X's on a treasure map, and a black crocheted sheath that Eleanor supposed could generously be described as a dress. Conformity, Eleanor thought, was depressingly inevitable. All these people, bearing their unique individual snowflakeness in the fearless flash of naked cheeks, nipples, chests, looked to her interchangeable. As the only nearly dressed person at a party full of the nearly naked, it was difficult to know who was more exposed. This was exactly what Eleanor had feared when she dressed that morning. How do I dress like I'm pro-recreational drugs? She'd wondered aloud. Seb, her housemate, motioned to himself, chinos and a shirt. Not cocaine, she clarified. Oh, he nodded his understanding. Like you go to festivals? Exactly. He waved his hand. Crop tops and little sunglasses and shit. Just dress like you love yourself sick. In a black denim skirt, a white crop top, and pink sunglasses with slits for lenses, Eleanor's cowboy hat was doing most of the legwork. She was not so much wearing it as suffering it, with a head-bent attitude of apology. Nonetheless, she hoped it made her look sure of herself or something. She'd entered via the back lane and was standing by the door a few metres away. Charlie was perched on the end of a long bench, 2 people on the ground at her feet. She had a VB in one hand and a cigarette in a comically long holder in the other. Eleanor felt, as she often did when she saw Charlie in a crowd, the sisterly stirrings of pride. With her cropped blonde hair, a strapless green top, and a very short green skirt, she was fairy-like, elegant and irreverent. She was telling a story, or perhaps impersonating someone. Eleanor saw her pull an un-Charlie face and flap her hands, while her audience of two laughed so hard they leaned on each other for support. Charlie had always been cooler than Eleanor. It was her beauty, her long-limbed elegance, as well as her natural warmth, which meant she could be cool without being exclusive. And although she envied her, there were also times, like now, when Charlie saw her from across the yard and leapt up to embrace her, that Eleanor felt cooler by association. They exchanged the same wide smile, which made their faces fall into what looked like their intended shapes, the cheeks rounded on either side, their noses drawn into a straight line. "Let me get you a beer," Charlie said. "I brought some." Eleanor held up a reusable grocery bag. "A nang then?" Charlie motioned to a fold-out table on the other side of the grass. Hanging from the back fence was a wooden board carved with the words "Nang Station." "Nice sign." "Kevin made it," Charlie said. "He's really talented." Eleanor squinted. The sign was certainly legible. She had to give him that. "Evidently." Charlie touched her arm. "Come on, I'll introduce you to my housemates. I'm sure I'll love them."
Thank you. The characters, all of the characters are really well realised. And I was curious because I'd heard for the first book that you wrote quite widely, a lot of different scenarios with the characters before writing an actual first draft. Is that how you worked with this one as well?
Yeah, but even more so, like with this one, I probably wrote twice as many scenes as ended up in the book.
Okay.
And yes, I think they were judicious cuts. I don't think anyone needs to read the other half. But so I kind of, before I had a plot, I had the idea of these two sisters, and then I kind of imagined all of the possible combinations of sort of scenes that I could think of with them and the other people in their world. And then I cut it back as I went. And when I had worked out what was worth keeping, I then did a plot.
Is there a little nod to Jane Austen in those characters as well? I was curious about that.
Yeah, it's not very subtle. It's so the sister in Jane Austen's novel Sense and Sensibility, the older sister is called Eleanor and she's sense, and the younger sister is more sensibility and she's more emotional, like my younger sister. It's a bit of a nod.
Yeah. Now, the other thing that we have in the book is a lot of role-playing, and I think it rings so true for families and actually all of us really. Can you talk a bit about what you were interested in these roles that we all play in exploring?
Yeah, so I was interested in the way that I think in families people often assume a role, and often it's different to the role that they would assume with their friends or in their kind of extra familial life, and then I guess that's why kind of family dramas have consumed so much of literature, because I think most people have that experience of when you're back with your family, you revert to that role that you've always played, or you revert to that younger version of yourself. And I think in this book, part of the sisters' process of maturing and developing because these sisters are very codependent and they mean a lot to each other, and I think part of their process of growing up is kind of seeing each other outside of those roles, and understanding each other as more than that. So I think and as you go through the book you learn a bit more about their past and you realise why they've adopted these roles, but basically Eleanor kind of is the one who takes responsibility, and she sees it as her sort of job to fix things and to save everybody, and she assumes that role, like no one's told her to do it, but she resents it anyway, as if she's been told to do it. And then Charlie, because she's a bit younger and she's sort of the vulnerable one who needs to be saved.
And that links into as well the idea of being a good person and the appearance of being a good person versus otherwise, really. It's a bit of a burden though, isn't it, for Eleanor? It really is. This role that she's trapped herself in. Yeah,
and I think for Eleanor the paradox that she encounters is that through clinging to this notion of herself as a good person and through kind of insisting that everybody see her that way, she actually gets herself into more trouble than if she had perhaps just admitted at the outset that she's like as flawed as everyone else.
Yeah. Yeah, another thing with the sisters that is really apparent, I think, is what they do, their jobs, their professions. And funnily enough, there's this section a bit further on from that extract that you read where Eleanor says, all these artists with their protests and their tiny sunglasses resisting capitalism or whatever it was they were resisting was like not trying to trip on the deck of a sinking ship. And that's just, I mean, throughout the whole book, there's these kind of hilarious moments and kind of acerbic, you know, sharp comments by Eleanor, and not just Eleanor, actually, Helen often as well. Just that cynicism you do so well in those characters, really. And a review from Reading saw the book as exploring the value of work and play, which I thought was really interesting that they drew that out, but in particular, in the art industries versus the value and stability of a conventional employment. And I was thinking of you, actually. Like, have you confronted that yourself in your life?
Yeah, this was. It's like this is going to be a really weird thing to say because no one really needs to go out and like defend corporate types. They're fine. But I think because I did a law degree, a lot of my friends who are people who I really respect and whose intellect and like emotional lives I value do work in corporate jobs. And almost all of the books I read, anyone who has a corporate job is usually a white older man who's like having sex with a much younger woman and is an unmitigated asshole. And I think they're often the like stand-ins for capitalism. And I think I just got to a point where I was like, well, this is absurd because so many people live under this system, and some of them have to have inner lives. So I'm out here defending them. So I was like, my protagonist is going to have a normal job, and she's still going to have deep thoughts. And like, you don't need to be like, I don't know, doing pottery all day, every day, and like living on the smell of an oily rag to like have thoughts.
Yeah.
Those people also have thoughts too, but I think that literature has them covered.
Now, Helen is a character who is also central to this novel. Can you start off by reading a really wonderful section of how Eleanor meets Helen?
Oh, yeah. So this is the section when Eleanor goes to see her sister in a play. So she says, it says, Eleanor didn't enjoy theatre. Every time she came to a show to support her sister, she would listen to the audience surrounding her and cringe. She particularly hated those self-congratulatory little laughs which declared, I get the joke, like society's great glaring inequalities were only perceptible to a particularly cultured eye. I'm not the problem, those snickers said, as if to snicker were to be self-aware, as if self-awareness were a solution. The few times Eleanor had been to the theatre with Mark, he had laughed as loud as the rest. Seated next to him, Eleanor had laughed too, and felt the stab of self-betrayal. Eleanor and Mark disagreed on matters of taste so often, and Eleanor relented so regularly that she wasn't sure she had tastes at all. Mark had worked diligently to paint Eleanor as a Philistine, wherever her opinions diverged from his. Movies Eleanor didn't like were just films she hadn't understood. Plays she found indulgent were scripts whose depths she was incapable of fathoming. Tonight, with a markless seat beside her, Eleanor admitted to herself that she never did, and certainly didn't now, care what happened on stage. It was a small freedom and difficult to enjoy because it left her trapped with her own thoughts. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror, her hands under the hot tap and her phone in her back pocket. Her eyes were momentarily relieved from the screen. She looked at the girl on her left and wondered where they'd met before. Maybe she'd seen her in another of Charlie's plays, or maybe it was just that her face, the small nose, the dark, emphatic eyebrows, was a type she'd seen 1,000 times before. Only a septum piercing, silver beads glinting in each nostril, distinguished her from any other boringly perfect face. Her blue eyes looking at Eleanor. Eye contact in a mirror is always more intense than in the flesh. Still conscious of her own reflection, Eleanor was acutely aware not only of seeing, but of being seen. She blushed as if caught in a private vanity. How are you finding the show? It's good. The actors are good. Eleanor looked from the mirror to her hands and then back up at the woman's real face. Well, it's a play, isn't it? The woman laughed and moved from the sink to the wall. She handed Eleanor a paper towel. You don't like plays? I like them, but surely theatre's just TV without famous people. And she laughed. And they don't even let you play on your phone while you're watching. Exactly, Eleanor said. It's coercive. They threw the used towels in the bin. The woman held the bathroom door open. Eleanor slipped through and, as if in thanks, said, "So do you know anyone in the show tonight, or do you just love theatre or something?" "I directed it." "Oh, did you?" Eleanor shook her head. "Of course she did." "Fuck you. Theatre's awesome." The director was smiling now too. "Have you tried TV though?" "I'm actually a very sophisticated person." The bell sounded the end of intermission. Eleanor, cheeks still hot, seized her opportunity. "Well, it was mortifying to meet you. Great job on the play. I'd better..." She'd already started to turn away when the director placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It gets better in the second half." The second half ran for 55 minutes, 55 of which Eleanor spent replaying her relationship with Mark.
Thanks so much for that. So what is it about Helen? Why is she so alluring and so appealing?
So Helen is that director who Eleanor meets in the bathroom, and Eleanor is a sort of mutual love interest of both sisters. And I think she's appealing because I think that she's got a real confidence in a way that Eleanor and Charlie perhaps lack. I think that Eleanor and Charlie both, they aspire to be a slightly different version of themselves, whether that be like a more moral or a more successful artistic version of themselves. Whereas Helen is just so reconciled with who she is. And I think that they both find that very attractive.
Yeah. What about the hierarchy of beauty to do with her? Like in one scene you talk about how inevitably there's hierarchies of beauty. I think Charlie says it from memory, in any social group of people. And Helen is quite at the top of that hierarchy, isn't she?
Yeah, like she's also hot. Which is I think that's why they're attracted to her. But I think it's kind of that also comes from her confidence. Like I think that she's probably not necessarily better looking than Charlie, but I think that she's just so comfortable in her own skin that people find it really attractive.
Another thing I really loved about that extract you read was the humour, but also the dialogue. And it's so sparky throughout this novel, and Love and Virtue as well. How do you do it? Do you read it out loud? How do you kind of do you fine-tune it in the second draft, or does it come quite naturally? Yeah,
I find dialogue the easiest to write. And often, so what I'll do when I'm writing a scene of people talking is I'll just write the dialogue. So it looks like a script, and then I'll go back in and be like, she flicked her hair, or he said, or whatever. And then I don't read it aloud, but I do sound it out in my head, and if it sounds awkward, or if I can't imagine myself saying it, then I'll go back and try and make it sound more organic.
Yeah, and in that scene as well, the idea of performance comes up. I mean, very literally it comes up in the book, but also metaphorically. Has this been something that you've been really interested in, like social media, for example, the performance on social media as well? Like there's lots of levels throughout the book.
Yeah, I'm always interested in performance and the way we perform in normal social settings. So I think in this, and we talked before about how the sisters kind of perform their different roles around each other. Yeah. And in that scene, when Eleanor kind of talks about her response to theatre, I think I find the way people engage with art interesting, because I think often when you go and see a play, it's not just the actors that are performing, the people in the audience are attending as a class performance, or as a performance of, like, they're the type of people who think about the right things, or engage at the right cultural level. And so, I think it's interesting to think about the ways that people perform outside those kind of really obvious structures of like a stage. And all the world's a stage.
But talking structure of the book, was that something that was planned early on? Did you let it unfold a bit more and see where it went, or was it a kind of a tightly imagined structure from the beginning?
No, it wasn't very tightly imagined, and it would probably have been a more efficient process if it were. I sort of, as I said before, I kind of wrote all of the scenes I could imagine for those characters until I felt like I knew them and knew how they would behave, and then I went back and I wrote a plot, and I didn't really deviate from that, but that was like halfway through the drafting process at that point.
The thing about this novel, and again that you write in general really, really well, is Sydney, which I also mentioned in the intro. And there's elements of Sydney that you capture unlike anyone else. And there's all these kind of little throughout every page, as I said. But for example, the heat of Sydney in January and squeezing.
Wouldn't it be nice if it was hot in Sydney for once?
I know, I miss it. I was nostalgically thinking about it, but just that squeezing a swim after work, and all those different places around Sydney. The Sydney Harbour and Redfern and Erskineville, and is it a bit of a love letter to Sydney?
Yeah. I mean, I do love Sydney, and I've lived here my whole life, and I think that, and this might have just been a kind of fault in my own reading or a gap, or sort of my own ignorance, but I felt like when I was younger, I didn't read many books that were set in Sydney, and so it was kind of this place that that was so important to me and that I lived in, but it didn't loom very large in my imagination, if that makes sense. Like any time I engaged with a piece of culture, it was elsewhere. And I think that's such a shame because Sydney's so beautiful, and I think it is really vivid, and I think it's the kind of visually stunning enough that it does have a real impact on mood and the way that people interact with each other. And I love Sydney.
And that was another really clever thing that you did, actually. The kind of the moods of whatever it was, the sticky sunlight would reflect the character. I thought that was really clever. Throughout the book, you kind of melded the two really seamlessly.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, well, I guess that's just how I experience Sydney in summer. Like, if you go to the beach and it starts to rain, day ruined. Like, it doesn't matter how great the conversation is that you're having or whatever. Like, show's over, go home.
Last year ruined,
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of musings about love in this book, which makes for very juicy reading as well. And there's a quote by Martha Nussbaum in the beginning, which is, "Meaningful commitment to a love in the world can require the sacrifice of one's own moral purity." Did that quote help catalyse some of your ideas in the novel, or did you find that one afterwards?
I found that, you asked me whether I have a plot at the start. I was really struggling with the end. And then I read a great essay by Martha Nussbaum, which was then the quote at the start of the book. So she's an American philosopher, and she was, it's kind of summarised in that quote, but she's just sort of saying that on that question of what if your happiness comes at the expense of someone you love, she sort of says that any wholly committed romantic relationship requires putting distance between other people in your life, and because to be so wholly committed to someone is like an act of prioritization, so it necessitates changing your relationships with other people. And she kind of argues that it is actually a sign of maturity to be able to accept that and commit and make that leap and also accept the consequences. And I think that what had happened in the arc of one of the characters in the book is that she wants to take what she wants but not accept the consequences for having it. And so anyway, I read that essay and I was like, that's what I've been trying to say. Thank you for being so smart. And then and in that essay she talks about a scene from a different book which demonstrates that. And then that was like how I got my closing scene. I was like, fantastic. Just on the way for me.
Thanks, Martha.
Yeah.
The other thing that the quote actually touches on is those moral grey areas that you do so well. And everything, I feel like today, so much of our lives are kind of black and white, and, it's the whole Twitter sphere. It's a lot of conversation. And what you bring out so beautifully is that nuance. The characters don't have to be always lovable, like perfect or relatable or not relatable, but they're complex, they're flawed. It is really refreshing to read that.
Thank you. I do. I sort of worry about our like modern obsession with relatability. Like I sort of, because people often talk about books as being, it's good because it's relatable, and obviously that's great too, but I sort of think that contains an implication that if characters aren't like you or if you don't share their experiences, then you can't enjoy it. But I think we've also all had those experiences where sometimes the pieces of art you most enjoy are where you really hate someone but you can see why they behaved the way they did, or I think yeah, I think sometimes it's more interesting to engage with experiences that are different from yours, but not in a judgmental way, like trying to understand why they behave like that.
And that's a nice segue to my last question, which is there's this conversation about art and empathy, actually, and Helen and Eleanor are talking about whether stories or art can reveal what it's like to be someone else. And Helen says, I think the best art knows it's not possible. So is it still worth striving for? I guess it is, isn't it?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think it is worth striving for, because even if you can't achieve it, we're all united in the act of striving, and that's what it is to be human.
But it was a really great phrase, because you do think, can you ever get into someone else's head? It's interesting, but that was a great passage, I thought.
Oh,
anyway,
thank you. Have to read the book to find out.
one last little question before we open it up to audience questions. Donna Tartt was a big inspiration for Love and Virtue. Was there other writers, apart from Martha that we just spoke about, who were particularly inspiring for this book?
Yes, I was inspired. Yeah, I hesitate to say them, because it always, I wouldn't dream of claiming equivalence, but I did. I sort of read a bunch of sort of literary sister pairs. So I reread Sense and Sensibility, and I read Howard's End, and then I also I feel like I can't say this because it always comes up in interviews and stuff, but I do love Sally Rooney, and I all of her books I think she's just so good at drawing out tension from everyday life, which is something I tried to do in this book.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to read. And now we will open up the conversation. So who has the first question? I'm being overwhelmed by questions right now. Okay.
There's a microphone. What's next, Dee? What can we expect?
I'm going to repeat it. So the question is, what's next?
I'm working on another book. But yeah, working. That's all I say. Don't clap. The pressure. That's it. Next question.
In light of the last question and the last little bit of what you said there, I wanted to say, how do you feel about being compared to Sally Rooney? Because when I think about your work and her work, it feels redundant to compare the two, because then, it takes away the power that you both have. How do you feel about that?
So I'll just repeat that. How do you feel about being compared to Sally Rooney?
Yeah, well, that's why I was hesitant to say that I read her books, because I don't want to invite that comparison necessarily. I do really love her writing, and I had loved it before Love and Virtue was published. So I'm just very flattered, and I know that it's technically reductive to just compare female writers because they're female and white and university educated, but I love it.
She also really captures the current moment like you do so very well, doesn't she?
Yeah, I think, I was talking about this recently. When I read Conversations with Friends, which is her first book, the year before I wrote Love and Virtue, and again, that might have just been a gap in my personal reading, but it was the first time that I had read a book that made the life that I led seem like it was worthy of a literary treatment. It was, I'd sort of never read a book where people instant messaged in the book and then people were reviewing it in literary journals, So, I think I felt like she gave me permission to think that my social world was worth writing about. Not in a, sorry, that makes it sound like my social world's not represented. It obviously is, more that it could be taken seriously as literature.
Yeah, and I like you don't shy away from using names like Hannah Gadsby, who is of this moment, to really kind of to make it of now as well, Yeah, there's some modern references which I had to explain to my parents. Okay.
What's ketamine?
Here's one right here. Sorry, I just repeat it every time for the recording.
Diane, I'm just curious, what's your impetus? What made you want to put these stories and characters out there into the public realm?
So what made you want to put these stories into the public realm?
Yeah, I don't really know. Yeah, well, I think for Love and Virtue, I genuinely didn't expect it to be published. So it's not like I had some greater like social purpose, or there was anyone in particular I was writing for, because I really didn't think anyone else would read it. So I think my impetus is just, I think I've just always loved reading so much, and I think that for me, part of my love of reading is sort of wrapped up in a feeling of awe and like, it would be amazing to be able to do that. And I think, yeah, when I read books, I like kind of trying to think about how it was constructed and picking it apart. So, yeah, I guess that makes me sound so egomaniacal. Like, I just do it for me, for fun. But that's kind of it, yeah. Like, I sort of just, I just do it because I find it interesting, and I think it's a worthwhile way to spend my time, I suppose, yeah. I wish I could be like, I did it for you. But yeah, no, it was for me.
Is it a 9 to 5? Like, are you literally sitting down 9 to 5, or how do you actually kind of structure your writing days?
Yeah, I try to keep it 9 to 5. So I do sit down for that period, but I don't necessarily work for all of that time. Yeah. I go on the internet, and which I guess we can call research. Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know how anyone writes with the internet, because it just...
Well, I do. I block it for periods. Like, I have an app that just blocks it for a couple of hours at a time. And I try to leave my phone in a different room. Yeah. So I don't have heaps of self-control. But I do try to, if I'm procrastinating, I try to procrastinate productively. So I try to like read a novel or something if I'm not typing away. Yeah.
Any other questions? Oh, great. Thank you.
Hi, I just wanted to ask if you had any tips for other young writers who are hoping to write a book.
So any tips for young writers hoping to write a book, please?
Yeah, my tip is just do it. Easier said than done. No, my tip is, I think don't wait for permission. Like, I think that in my case, I probably would, I think I would not have written Love and Virtue if it weren't for lockdown. And I think for me, lockdown gave me this freedom, because I was like, oh, well, nobody else is achieving anything anyway. So if I do this and it's a big waste of time, like everyone else is wasting their time, which is a crazy way to think. And I think that if you're like waiting for someone to say, you should do this, you will be amazing at it, then that might never happen. So just, you need to be that person and just give yourself permission, and open the Word document. And then my other tiny tip, which is like very specific, but when I've been writing for a while and I'm like, oh God, this is awful, this is so embarrassing, like this can never see the light of day, I go on Microsoft Word and I zoom out, so I can see all of the pages as little white squares, and then I say to myself, that used to be one square. And look how many pages you have now. So you might find that helpful.
Hi. Okay, you know how you said that you had lots of scenes that you were like, I don't want to do anything with those. I guess my question is twofold. Was it just purely you who decided like this scene's going to make it into part of the storyline, this one isn't? And also, what are you going to do with all of them? Like, are they going to go into the next book, or are they going to go in the bin? Like,
Okay, so with all of those scenes that you wrote, how did you decide what went in and what went out, and what's going to happen to them now?
Yeah, so I guess it's twofold. So I do a first sort of vicious cull, and I'm quite, I guess, I just try to be my own worst critic, or my own harshest critic. So if anything's remotely cringe or a little bit boring, I just say goodbye. People might think I'm not the best judge of that. They might read this book and be like, oh, that made it in. And then I also work very closely with my publisher, who also does a round of edits with me, and I think we're pretty like if he says to cut something, I'm like, yep, it's gone. I'm trying to think if that's an exaggeration. No, I don't think it is. I think I pretty much do what I'm told. And then, sorry, we have a very healthy working relationship, but I think I'm just so conscious that other people have to read this, and so, and you know, like we will have to press print one day, so if one person thinks that scene's not worth it, then I'm like, okay, well, we're not putting it in the final copy then. And then in terms of what I'm going to do with it, when I'm working on another thing, I then sometimes do go through. It's just a big document called Offcuts on my computer, and I do go through it, and there's sometimes like descriptions of things that I use later. So there would be stuff in this book that was from the Love and Virtue Offcuts.
Ah, right.
Yeah, but it's never like a whole...
Stockpile, that's a great word. That sounds really handy to have.
Yeah, but it would never be like a whole scene. It would just be like a little description of something. Yeah.
Right. Well, Diana, a huge congratulations on this absolutely wonderful book. I recommend everyone gets multiple copies, buy 10, buy 20, for everyone you love. It's fantastic. And let's just have a big round of applause for Diana, and congratulations on this launch.
Thanks.